The first time I saw her, the entire room went quiet in that particular way Toronto crowds go quiet. Not rude, just careful, like nobody wanted to be caught looking and then caught looking away. It was the Maple Crescent Foundation's Winter Gala, held in the ballroom of the Fairmont on Front Street. The kind of event where the ice sculptures cost more than my monthly rent in Parkdale. Outside, the snow was coming down sideways off the lake, and inside, the chandeliers threw light across a floor so polished I could see my own reflection looking back up at me, unsure of itself. I was 26, working as a junior logistics coordinator for the event company that had been hired to run the night, which meant I wasn't a guest, I was staff, and staff at a gala like that exists to be invisible. My father had thrown his back out on a construction site in Brampton 8 months earlier, and between his disability claim getting tangled in paperwork, and my mother's hours getting cut at the hospital, I'd taken this job because it paid better than anything else I could find with a logistics diploma and no connections. Then the doors at the far end opened, and she walked in. Her name was Caroline Ashford Rise, though I wouldn't learn that for another 20 minutes. She wore a deep emerald gown that moved like water when she walked, and the right side of her face, from her temple down along her jaw, carried scarring that caught the light differently than the rest of her skin, pale ridges against warm brown. She didn't try to hide it. No scarf, no angled hair, nothing. She just walked into that room like she dared it to look at her, and the room, in its careful Canadian way, mostly didn't. A few people murmured behind their wine glasses. Nobody was cruel out loud. That's not really how it works here. The cruelty is quieter, made of averted eyes and conversations that suddenly need to happen somewhere else. But it was cruelty all the same, just dressed in politeness instead of malice. If you've ever watched someone get erased by a room full of people too polite to actually look at them, you already know the feeling that was building in my chest. If that feeling means something to you too, hit like before we keep going. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. And subscribe, because I have a lot more of these stories and I think you'll want to hear them. My job that night was simple. Keep the floor clear, manage the catering timeline, make sure the band's set transitions didn't trip over the speeches. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the actual guests. My supervisor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Brigitte Holt, had told me twice already to stop hovering near the edge of the dance floor and go check on the kitchen staff. But then the band leader announced the first formal dance set. Couples started pairing off in that easy, practiced way wealthy people pair off, and Caroline Ashford Rise was left standing alone near the tall windows, holding a champagne flute she wasn't drinking from, watching the floor fill up around her like water rising and leaving her on a little island nobody wanted to wade out to. I want to be honest about something. I almost didn't do it. I thought about my paycheck, about Brigitte's voice in my ear telling me to mind my own lane, about the fact that the man hosting this entire gala, Desmond Ashford Rise, her father, founder of a logistics and shipping empire headquartered 2 blocks from where I was standing, could end my employment with a single sentence to the right person. I thought about all of that, and then I thought about the look on her face, which wasn't anger, and wasn't even really sadness. It was the specific tiredness of someone who has gotten extremely good at being alone in a crowded room. I crossed the floor. It felt longer than it was. I remember the carpet changing to hardwood under my dress shoes. The sound of my own heartbeat louder than the string quartet. The way 2 guests near the bar actually stopped their conversation to watch a member of the event staff walk toward the host's daughter like he had any business doing so. When I reached her, I didn't have a speech prepared. I just bowed slightly, too formally I'd realize later, like I'd learned manners from old movies instead of real life, and asked if she'd like to dance. She looked at me for a long moment. Up close, the scarring traced delicately along her cheekbone, thinner near her eye, more textured near her jaw, and her uninjured eye was a clear hazel that seemed to be doing the work of evaluating me completely on its own. I remember thinking she had every reason to say no. I was staff. I had no business asking. And for a second I thought she might just walk away and spare us both the awkwardness. Instead, she set her champagne flute down on the windowsill and put her hand in mine. Her fingers were cold from being near the window, and they were shaking just slightly. The way hands shake when you're doing something you've talked yourself out of doing 100 times before. We stepped onto the floor and I felt every eye in that ballroom land on us at once, the way you feel sunlight on your skin before you even look up to find it. I wasn't a good dancer, My mother had tried to teach me for my cousin's wedding 3 years earlier and given up after 20 minutes. Laughing too hard to keep teaching, but I kept my eyes on Caroline and not on the scarring, not because I was trying to be noble about it, but because her eyes were the most interesting thing in the room, and the scars were just part of her face the same way her cheekbones were, or her jawline, or the small gap in her front teeth that showed when she finally cautiously started to smile. Halfway through the song, her shoulders came down from somewhere near her ears, where I hadn't even noticed they'd been sitting. Her hand loosened in mine. I could feel her actually settling into the dance instead of enduring it, and something about that, about being the reason a stranger's body finally relaxed, hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. I noticed her father watching from the staircase landing above the floor. I want to say his face was angry, because that would make a better story, but it wasn't. It was complicated in a way I didn't fully understand yet. Protective, calculating, and underneath all of it, something that looked almost like hope, like he'd been waiting a long time for a moment exactly like this one, and had stopped expecting it to come. I'd learned later that 2 years before that night, Caroline had been driving home along Highway 401 near Whitby in the middle of a January ice storm when she came across an overturned vehicle, fuel leaking, a woman trapped behind the wheel with her seatbelt jammed. Caroline pulled her out seconds before the car caught fire. The woman walked away with a broken wrist. Caroline walked away with second and third-degree burns along the side of her face and neck that no amount of plastic surgery in Toronto's best clinics could fully undo. For about 3 weeks, she'd been a local news story. Brave Whitby area woman saves stranger from burning wreck, and then the news cycle moved on to something else, the way it always does. And all that was left was a young woman with scars and a city that had already stopped paying attention to anything except how she looked now. The song ended. She didn't pull her hand back right away. She held on a beat longer than the music required, like she was trying to memorize something, and then she said the thing I've thought about more times than I can count since. She told me she wasn't going to forget this. Not because I'd danced especially well, I hadn't, and not because I'd said anything particularly charming, because I genuinely hadn't said much of anything. She said it was because I hadn't looked away, not once. The applause that followed was polite, a little uncertain, the way Canadian applause tends to be when nobody's quite sure what they just witnessed, but something in the room had shifted. A couple approached her afterward, then another. The ice, as much as I hate the phrase, had actually cracked. I figured that would be the end of it. A strange electric moment I'd tell my roommate about over beers, and then file away as the most interesting thing that had ever happened to me at a work event. I was wrong. The next morning I got a call asking me to come to the Ashford Rise Logistics Group offices on Bay Street, the 40th floor, with a view that stretched all the way out over Lake Ontario toward the islands. I spent the entire elevator ride convinced I was being fired for overstepping a line that, in hindsight, I absolutely had overstepped. Instead, Desmond Ashford Rise sat behind a desk that probably cost more than my parents' mortgage and studied me for what felt like a full minute before he said anything at all. Then he asked me, simply, why I'd done it. I told him the truth, because I couldn't think of a more impressive lie fast enough. I said nobody deserves to be left standing alone like that, not at a party where everyone's supposed to be celebrating generosity. He didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, what he told me changed the direction of my life. Caroline hadn't attended a single public event in almost 14 months. She'd turned down therapy from local outlets, from flow outlets, wanting a "where is she now" piece, and had become, in his words, someone he barely recognized from the daughter who used to argue with him at the dinner table about everything from municipal politics to which hockey team actually deserved to be called Ontario's team. But the night before, she'd asked her father, unprompted, who I was. He offered me a position with the Foundation's outreach division. Not because my resume had impressed him, he was honest as enough to say that outright, but because his daughter had smiled for the first time in months, and he wanted to understand why. I started the following month, coordinating hospital visits for burn survivors across the GTA and helping set up a scholarship fund for the families of first responders. Caroline began showing up to meetings a few weeks in, quiet at first, standing near the back, then closer to the front, slowly reclaiming rooms she'd spent over a year avoiding entirely. The first time she spoke publicly again was at Sick Kids, in front of a ward of pediatric burn patients and their families. Her voice shook as she pulled back the light scarf she'd taken to wearing for these visits and let the kids see her scars without flinching. She told them surviving something wasn't supposed to be a secret you carried alone. I stood near the doorway, watching, my chest doing something complicated that I didn't have a word for yet. It wasn't a straight line from there, and I think that's important to say, because the straight line version of this story would be a lie. Old photos resurfaced online with cruel comments attached. A board member quietly raised the question of whether her visibility might affect brand perception for corporate sponsors. A phrase that made me want to throw something through Bay Street's expensive windows. I watched her read those comments alone one night after a donor dinner, sitting in her car in an underground parking garage, the old exhaustion creeping back into her face like weather rolling back in off the lake. I reminded her of the ballroom, of the version of herself who chose to step onto that floor instead of melting into the crowd. A year passed. The foundation's donations nearly doubled. The burn survivor outreach program expanded from the GTA into Ottawa and eventually Montreal. More than any of that, though, Caroline started walking into rooms without that flinch in her shoulders, the one I'd felt ease out of her hand on that very first instance. Somewhere between hospital hallways and late-night strategy sessions over bad coffee, something between us shifted to something neither of us had planned for. But both of us, I think, had been quietly hoping for. One evening, almost exactly a year later, we went back to that same ballroom at the Fairmont for the Foundation's next winter gala. This time, Caroline's insisted there be no special introduction, no staged inspiring survivor moment for the program, just two people at a party. When the band started, she turned to me first, before anyone else had even moved toward the floor. There were no whispers this time. We walked onto the floor as equals, nobody staring, or if they were, it didn't carry the same weight it once had. As we danced, she leaned in close and told me that for a long time after the accident, she'd believed beauty and love and belonging were things that had burned away along with everything else that night on the 401. She said the moment I'd crossed that ballroom a year earlier had never really been about romance. Not at first. It had been about dignity, about being seen as a person instead of a cautionary tale. She told me I'd given that back to her. If any part of this story found you tonight, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you hit like, shared it with someone who needs the reminder that they're not too much to look at, and subscribed so I can keep telling you stories like this one. And before I go, comment the word seen if you believe every scar carries a story worth more than the silence people give it. Here's what that winter in Toronto taught me, more than anything else I've learned before or since. Courage doesn't always look like pulling someone from a burning car. Sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it's just a junior staff member crossing a hardwood floor when every reasonable instinct told him to stay where he was supposed to be. Caroline once told me she'd never forget that I didn't look away. The truth is, neither will I. Not because of the scars, but because of the way she taught an entire ballroom, and one nervous 26-year-old in particular, that the bravest thing any of us can do is let ourselves be seen.